Our next panel is titled Regional Security, Middle East and U.S. AFRICOM. Chairman Kevin Brown, chairman of the Mohegan tribe, will moderate the discussion. The chairman served in the United States Army and retired as a highly decorated colonel with extensive experience in strategic planning, combat leadership, and leading large military and civilian organizations. I give you our next speaker and the chair of our panel, Kevin Brown.
Hello. It's working. You can hear me, right? All right. So we did survive lunch for the most part, I see, with most of the crowd still intact. Thank you to the World Affairs Council for the invite. This is my second opportunity. The last time I was sort of an incidental speaker in that, as many of you that are Connecticut residents know, we're currently developing an integrated resort in Seoul, South Korea. And so being highly aware of all of the important considerations that we've discussed today at the last event with the ambassador to the U.S., I was able to visit with that one. It's good to be back, and thank you for the opportunity to moderate. Excuse me. And the tribe itself, the Mohegan tribe, is proud to be a sponsor of this important WAC organization and all that it does. And I often tell folks when we get uber focused on casinos around here, and some of you know that has consumed some of my personal time here in this state, that there is a big wide world outside of the 130 by 70 mile square area of the state of Connecticut, and there are other things to talk about. So I can't think of a better thing to be doing on my Saturday than to talk to you all about something other than casinos. You know that old tired joke about I'm not a doctor, but I stayed in a Holiday Inn Express last night? I'm all but dissertation. So I'm not quite a doctor yet in security studies, but I have helped recruit, train, employ, and oversee Iraqi security forces and Iraqi police forces on the ground. And so sometimes today as I moderate, I might get super granular and tactical, but I think it's important to consider in how we implement our national security strategy down at that tactical level, the level that General Casey spoke about, where you've got young men and women that are United States citizens out there turning wrenches that have been handed to them for the first time. And if we're going to be engaged across the Middle East and North Africa in any way, shape, or form, you kind of got to know what's going to happen when things are really occurring, either diplomatically, through State Department, or through military action. With us today, we have two gentlemen that understand all of that, the entire spectrum, from the tactical through the operational and the strategic. You've already been introduced to General Jones today, as he moderated earlier, and General Lariviere. Lariviere, I said it right once. I'll just say General from this point forward.
Jim will do.
These gentlemen have done exactly what I just said. They've led forces at the troop, battery, and company level. They've been engaged at the operational level in employing forces large scale, and they've been involved in the development of policy and national security strategy throughout the Middle East and North Africa. So we're pleased to have you gentlemen here with us today, and thankful that we've got this kind of experience with us. This discussion, as I think General Jones pointed out earlier, deserves the arc of history to give it some context. Next month marks the 100th year that the Sykes-Picot Agreement was no longer a secret, and the world knew that the British and the French were going to establish mandates throughout the Middle East post-World War I. And how those boundaries were drawn and all things that have happened since are absolutely relevant to the conversation today, and a lot of the threats that we see in the area, be it the crisis in Syria, destabilization in Yemen, any of the matters of the fractionalization and franchising of terrorist organizations throughout the area. We today have ISIL, the Islamic State, and it has been claimed by Abu Omar al-Baghdadi that they intend to rectify all the problems that the Sykes-Picot Agreement created in the first place. So the arc of history of 100 years is actually pretty short when you think about all the things these gentlemen are going to talk to us about today, and where it all sort of emanated and came from. So at this time, what I'll do is turn it over to each of them for some opening remarks, and then we'll, as the other panels have done, moderate through some questions and then turn it over to you for your questions of the panel. First, I'll turn to General Jones. Now, I will specifically point to the Middle East and North Africa. However, as we know, there is no real border in these conversations. We may end up in Venezuela by the time it's all said and done. But first, I'll turn to General Jones to talk about the security threats in the Middle East.
Thanks, Chairman. And first of all, I want to get it on the record and distance myself from the Chairman's remarks that all the problems in the Middle East are the result of the French and the British. I'm not going there.
Sir, I was reflecting on my own tribal issues here in the United States of America.
The second thing is, I promise you, I am not the harbinger of doom. Although it probably seems that way with the two topics that I'm talking about today with you. Well, first of all, if you had to put it in one statement, I think the biggest issue in the Middle East, and I include kind of Southwest Asia as part of this whole rubric because they're really all tied together in a big way. But the single biggest issue is the level of violence and turmoil in the region. And the fact is, you can't separate this region, and you can't put up a fence around them and say, okay, it all is going to stay inside of that any more than you can, any other region around the world. So all of that has a very big impact, I think, on us and our partners around the world. And I think it boils down to really 6 big issues that we ought to be thinking about and concerned about, and that deserve some attention. The first is this issue of what we call under-governed space. And that is, in some cases, ungoverned, but in places where countries cannot control what goes on in their sovereign territory. And as a result of that, it gives freedom of action to a whole host of unsavory characters that run the gamut from just criminals in international crime organizations all the way to international terrorist organizations. And so this business of under-governed space is one that has been in existence for a long time, but as the technology and things have moved along, it makes it a bigger issue that we need to pay attention to. I think the second is the number of violent franchises has grown. This is no longer a world in which Al-Qaeda is the concern. Al-Qaeda has had franchises and spin-offs and other people that have looked at what they've done and how they've done it. And so the numbers of those entities have grown, and that should be a concern because the more you have to deal with, the more complex this gets for everybody. I think and General Casey and I might agree, I think in the region the chances of interstate conflict are actually increasing. They certainly, I think, have increased more over the last decade or two. It may not be unprecedented, but it's certainly a trend that I'm concerned about. Now, you can look at those frictions in terms of the number of proxy wars that are being fought, and I'll just use one example, and that is the war in Yemen. Although theoretically it's a war between the Houthis and the government, the reality is it's just a reflection of the tensions between Saudi Arabia and the Iranians, and it's being played out as a proxy war. If it stays self-contained and ultimately gets resolved there and that, okay, I understand there's some people that might not be concerned about it. But as we all know, war is often the product of miscalculation by at least one and often two parties. And the opportunities for miscalculation based on what happens in Yemen are always present. And you can also look at Syria and other places as a place where that could evolve into interstate conflict. The next big issue is the issue of the ethnic divisions and tensions that exist. You see it most reflected in the news recently with the Kurdish referendum, but the fact is that these kind of low-simmering, sometimes boiling, sometimes not, ethnic tensions continue to be a big factor in the region. And it's not difficult to see how you could suddenly have the Kurdish population, which happens to be one of the better organized and armed and war-fighting entities in the region, suddenly being at odds not only with the forces and the government inside their own country, but also with the Iranians and the Turks, who have a vested interest in not having a Kurdish state. But you can see that in other places as well. And then I think the next big factor is assuming that Syria stabilizes and that Hezbollah regains a freedom of maneuver. I think that it's impractical not to think that there aren't going to be rising tensions and a possibility of conflict between Hezbollah in Israel or other proxies that Hezbollah enlists in other factors. So the Israeli, Palestinian / Arab issues continue to be there unresolved, and it always has the potential to grow and to become more problematic. And then the last major area that I think we need to be concerned about is not a military one, but it's what I would call the environmental and economic issues. We mentioned one this morning, which was water. Water has the potential in the region to become really an inflammatory issue. I don't know what it is today because there's been some displacement, but the prediction a few years ago was Sana'a in Yemen was going to run out of water in 2020. Likewise in Gaza, the aquifer in Gaza has become salinated with salt water and is very soon going to be unusable and create a major crisis for the people who live in Gaza having no source of fresh water. The tensions is upstream folks try to use water like Turkey and Syria with their neighbors is they create dams, use that water so the downstream folks that have been used to getting it don't have it, and on and on. So that has the potential to become a real problem. And on the energy side, the economic side, I don't know how many of you all are involved in the utility industry, but I know of at least one person. And if you talk about it from an energy perspective, nirvana in the energy world is when we get to a solution that allows us to use renewables in lieu of fossil fuels. And the long pole in that tent is storage. We can produce fairly economically power from solar, from wind, from geothermal, all kinds of things. But storing that energy is a problem. When there's a breakthrough in storage technology, could be a huge disruptor in the economic world of those countries. And in this region, the main economic driver, of course, is fossil fuel. So what happens when all these countries who are kind of keeping a lid to some degree on things by virtue of oil money, energy money, what happens when suddenly that becomes a whole lot less valuable? And with that, the economic crisis that happens, what happens in a region that's already got so many other problems? And with that depressing assessment, maybe we'll get to some more optimistic things about what you do about it. I'll end.
Thanks, sir. And the interesting thing there, and I'm sure we'll get into it later with some of the question and answer, is sort of the revival of discussion about Hezbollah and Hamas. I say revival because we're all talking about the Sunni-Shia divide over the past number of years and laying in the background, laying weight perhaps on an opportunity. We have those arms that moved from a terrorist type organization to a political arm and actually will be power players in the future of the Middle East. Over to the good general from North Africa.
So I'm going to talk a little more about wider than just North Africa, but I do have to say that it's not very often I get the opportunity to be the upbeat side of the conversation when you talk about Africa after put up from the toss off from CENTCOM. So no, I appreciate the opportunity to talk with you all today. It's a distinguished group, and I'm excited to be here. And as I think I've told a couple of you, I feel there's a couple of Africa experts out there in the crowd, so there's a couple of ringers out there, so I will defer defer to some of them if I get a question that I can't handle. I am going to talk about all of Africa, not just the Mideast, North Africa. As many of you know, the Department of Defense does it differently than everybody else. AFRICOM has 53 of the 54 countries in Africa, with Egypt going to CENTCOM, whereas the rest of the government, U.S. government, does Mideast, North Africa, and then there's Sub-Saharan Africa. But I'm going to talk a little bit on the wider Africa context. I'm going to frame my remarks around two statements that we used to use all the time. Some could be construed as somewhat cynically. One is Africa, it's a continent, not a country. And two is Africa, it doesn't matter till it matters. So what do I mean by that? Africa is a continent, not a country. People tend to just say, hey, we're going to deal with Africa. And they don't really stop to think, or they don't know about the diversity and the size of the continent and what they're actually dealing with. There's somewhere between 1,200 to 2,100 different languages and dialects, divided into over 2,000 tribes, somewhat artificially contrived into 54 countries. And as I said, 53 of them belong to AFRICOM, and Egypt gets to go to CENTCOM. The landmass is huge. The landmass of the United States, China, Europe, and India all fit into the landmass of Africa with room left over. By 2025, 2.5 billion people will be living on the African continent, half of whom will be under the age of 25. 1 in 5 of those Africans, just like they are today, will be Nigerian. And Nigeria will be the 3rd largest country by population in the world, behind India and China. It's a continent of contrasts. You have the Saharan and Sub-Saharan Africa. You've got the Arab Berber versus the Black African. You have Islam versus Christian/animist. So you have these incredible fault lines that kind of crisscross the continent. And so you get these kind of contrasts where, on one hand, the UN says that 6 of the top 13 fastest growing countries in the world are resident in Africa, with Ethiopia being number 1. And at the same time, 8 of the current ongoing 15 peacekeeping operations in the world take place in Africa at the same time. In 2000, The Economist magazine said that Africa was the hopeless continent. By 2011, they were calling it the rising continent, and by 2013, they were calling it the hopeful continent. So there's progress being made, but not without its difficulties. My second statement was Africa, from the U.S. national security perspective, Africa, it doesn't matter till it matters. And I want to thank this morning's panelists and speakers for setting me up perfectly, because I felt like I was back in some of the staff meetings we used to have in J5 Africa, where 3 times a week you do the stand-up, go around the room and talk about all the threats in the world. And so I used to tell General Wolf, my boss, I said, sir, after dealing with complex subjects like cyber and nukes and landmines and other complicated issues, Africa offers some pretty basic coup d'etats, revolts, and insurrections. It's something you can really kind of wrap your heads, infantrymen can wrap their heads around. But I'm being facetious. But if you think about it, one of the challenges for those who work Africa and for the security challenges on the continent, you'll notice this morning General Casey took a tour of the world, and it's very similar to the same kind of tour of the world that senior leaders, SecDef, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs, when you go over to the White House, the Principals Committee get. They're focused on the current construct, I think they call it, is the 4+1. So it's China, Russia, Iraq, North Korea, plus transnational terrorism. You throw in cyber loose nukes. And it's hard to find in there, General Casey didn't mention it all, where Africa fits in there. Because when you look at it across the board, it's very hard to discern what the U.S. vital U.S. national security interests are on the continent that would get you focused on that. And so there tends to be this idea, just like there was this morning, of just we take the tour of the world of world threats, and this really doesn't register. And so that's the it doesn't matter part of my previous statement. And you can even see it in the defense planning guidance. The 2012 defense planning guidance that I was operating under when I was on the Joint Staff. So the defense planning guidance that we were operating under, 100-page document, covers all sorts of threats and issues and provides guidance. One line talks about Africa. It said, whenever possible, we will develop innovative, low-cost, small-footprint approaches to achieve our security objectives, relying on exercises, rotational presence, and advisory capabilities. And that pretty much says it all. Africa, we take risk in Africa. When we created AFRICOM, they created it in a different way as a light footprint operation that would play support roles to state and AID, who decidedly have the lead on the continent for all for diplomacy and international development, with the military piece being very, very much third tier in that entire in the 3Ds that General Casey talked about this morning. And you can see it in the footprint on the continent. For as big as the continent is that I just described, we have exactly one permanent base in Djibouti, and most of the activity that goes on there is faced up towards CENTCOM rather than south towards the African continent. And so that has been the national approach. That has been the U.S. approach to the continent. Now, I said it doesn't matter until it matters, because every now and then it really does matter. So it mattered in 2011 when we were on again, off again. Were we going to get involved in the overthrow of Gaddafi? The answer turned out to be yes. And all of a sudden, Odyssey Dawn takes place, and we're still talking about the fallout, both military and political, from that in the state, in the much undergoverned space of Libya, as well as the fallout from Secretary Clinton's, taking all the heat for the aftermath of that with the death of Ambassador Stevens down the road. It mattered in 2014 when an Ebola crisis broke out in West Africa, and we woke up one morning to find out that the president had decided we were putting 3,000 troops on the ground in Liberia, which at the time turned out to be way more than we had fighting ISIS in Iraq and Syria. And so, again, it doesn't matter until it matters, and then it matters a whole lot, and the U.S. gets involved, but usually in ways that are unconventional and not the norm, and often against threats that are not the conventional type of threat that you normally see military personnel addressing. So with that, I'll stop. We can flip it back over.
Are you folks hearing us okay? All right. Well, thanks to both gentlemen for those opening comments. And one point that I was supposed to make before we began, both are lifetime members of the Military Officers Association, so please go easy on them here up front. So common to both was the discussion of ungoverned spaces, and what wasn't invoked in the initial conversation was Afghanistan, a classic ungoverned space that has caused us to be in a period of protracted conflict for going on 16 years now. So I guess my question to each of you might be, what ungoverned or poorly governed space in each of these regions might you point at as the most problematic and the place where U.S. interests and national security efforts might be best focused?
Okay, I'll start that. Well, I mean, most of them in the Middle East and in Southwest Asia are pretty obvious. Obviously, Syria is the one that has our attention most of the time, only because ISIS managed to take advantage of it and grow to essentially have many of the characteristics of a nation state. If you look at the amount of revenue that they were bringing in, and the kind of activities that was funding, obviously that was a big problem. But if you look at other places, one of the things when I first became the J3 at Central Command, one of the things we did was we looked at the region and said, we have to try, rather than reacting to where all of these organizations are growing, we need to go find out where are they going to go. Because as a general rule, terrorist organizations are like water on a table. You can squish them with military force, but what happens inevitably, they all bubble out and go somewhere else. And so the only way to get after this is to go to where they're going to go, sort of the Wayne Gretzky
the reason I'm great is I skate to where the puck is going to be. So and so as we looked at that, I mean, the obvious thing was Yemen was very high on the list. We actually tried to get into Yemen and get into the preventive mode of helping folks there prevent what would eventually happen. Inside Iraq, you still have a tremendous amount of area of undergoverned space. Afghanistan, and really there are elements in a lot of these stands that are undergoverned, and you can argue Western Pakistan is probably the most significant in terms of its impact on us and potential impact. And then you look at places that you don't think about very often, but like the Sinai. The Sinai is starting to show what the result is of huge swaths of undergoverned space, and that is folks will go there as a place to recover when they're hammered somewhere else. So really, and you can almost go through every country and find some places within those countries that are undergoverned where really those national governments need to reestablish control, establish the rule of law, and gain dominance over that space.
So number one in Africa at this point would have to be Libya. Libya is actually, and it's actually if there was going to be a nexus for any sort of vital national security interests for the United States and our allies, it probably would be in Libya from this standpoint. With the fall of Gaddafi in 2011, the governing council took over. Subsequent elections in 2012, they created a government called the HOR, the House of Representatives. They eventually, GNC, the General National Council. Subsequent elections to that elected a thing called the HOR that the GNC didn't recognize, split into two. They started a pretty conventional civil war. Eventually, a UN comes in, negotiates yet a third government. So we have essentially in Libya, I can't decide whether it's undergoverned or overgoverned because they have they literally have three different governments contesting for power there. With all that and the unrest, it has become a haven for everybody on the continent to get to Libya, to them as the jumping off point to get to someplace in southern Europe, contributing in a large part to the migration problem, which is thus causing the southern NATO neighbors to distract themselves from what big NATO would like to focus on, which is their Russia problem, because all the southern neighbors are focused on what their real, no kidding, right here staring me in the face, national security problem. I'm being overrun by refugees from Libya, or moving through Libya. So I'd say that was probably the number one driver of insecurity that kind of bleeds over into another area right now in Africa. But Africa's got plenty of others, but that's the number one on the hit parade.
So in light of the the Libya conversation and the instability that came, and this was alluded to earlier, I believe during General Casey's remarks, perhaps even the earlier panels, there is the question of how we handle situations where authoritarian regimes, while not perfectly aligned with perhaps U.S. democratic principles and human rights, are at least stable in their current state. And General Casey actually alluded to, and nobody sort of redirected on it, the fact that perhaps we should consider that the devil we know in Alawi might be the way to sustain some stability in Syria. General Jones, I'm curious what you might think about that.
I'll say something to infuriate everybody, but give me a chance to put it in context, and that is the great movement towards accelerated democracy that everybody had real optimistic views on during the Arab Spring has essentially proven to be a failure virtually everywhere, with the exception of one country. And what you've seen happen is that authoritarian regimes are beginning to emerge back again as being the dominant entities in their country, and are taking a much more active role with suppressing opposition and so forth. Now, from From the perspective of promoting democracy, promoting human rights, that's a very negative trend. From the perspective of security, there probably are some positive sides of that, the other side of that coin. And that is, if you look at Egypt today as probably the poster child of the trend of what's happened, I think it's pretty hard to argue that Egypt is a less stable place and has less negative impact in the world than it did when the Muslim Brotherhood was controlling the government. So I think that we're seeing a trend where authoritarian regimes are becoming more dominant and getting greater control. I think in the short term, from a security perspective, that may be of benefit to both the countries and folks around the country in the region. We have to kind of examine what do we do about it in the longer term based on our concerns about human rights, about the concerns of trying to promote democracy and so forth. And how do we achieve the right balance to try to move these folks forward at a pace that is sustainable without inducing the kind of chaos that we've seen emerge over the last few years as they made their initial foray into that.
So from the continent's perspective, it's interesting. The one country where it started, the Arab Spring started, and where it's actually turning out happens to be Tunisia. So, and having worked with the Tunisians closely during my time in the Joint Staff, they are really struggling and trying to do the right thing. And so I really admire them for that. On the rest of the continent, it's kind of interesting because the one man, one vote, one time strongman model is actually kind of the model, and it's the model that has been going on with varying degrees of with varying trends towards more authoritarian and less authoritarian since the end of the colonial period. But you can still see on the continent a number of strongmen regimes that we have just let go, that we just let it go because it's relatively stable. They're rights abusers, but they're not horrible human rights abusers, and so we let, Robert Mugabe's been there since Zimbabwe got its independence in 1980. Just last week, Angola, Dos Santos, moved on. He's been there since 1979. Uganda is having another round with Museveni. I think he's in his fourth term. He got the Constitution changed last time so he could do a third term. Now he's trying to get the Constitution changed so he can serve past the age of 75. So we have a number of these on the continent that continue to move on, and we work on them and try to mitigate it. But by and large, with that one exception in Libya, when I think it's just because it was Gaddafi, and with all the history that we had, at least for the rest of the continent, we kind of take a step back and deal with whoever it is we're dealing with to the best that we can, and pressure them without with the threat of military threat of overthrow.
So for approaches on the continent, in the Middle East, what needs to change, or what do you foresee changing, particularly in light of the administration's approach to our engagement on what they would like to see more multilateral than unilateral solutions? Where do you see the U.S. implementing national security strategy in terms of defense first, maybe only, in either one of these regions, specifically to the earlier conversations about, I believe General Casey said it would take 150,000 troops to go back into the CENTCOM region to truly stabilize the Middle East under its current conditions. He didn't say that he proposed that, but that's what it would take. So how do we manage the matter of achieving our national interests in the Middle East, either with or without Department of Defense on the ground?
This is common sense. Everybody in here knows this, and that is we have to be engaged diplomatically. We're not. John Casey used the term leading from behind. I prefer to use the term leading. Because one of the things that took me a long time in the military to understand was there was really a difference between leadership and authority. And it occurred to me at some point, most of the reason why everybody that worked for me did what they did had nothing to do with leadership. It had to do with authority. I was in charge. Their job was to follow the orders that I gave them and so forth, and that was authority. Leadership is needed when people don't have to follow orders, that they're not under your authority. And frankly, we need to lead. We have to work with all of these other countries in the region to figure out how can we align our interests in a way that allow us to achieve our important national security objectives, at the same time allowing them to achieve theirs. Because if we're at odds, we're not going to make much headway. And in the other pieces, we have to take this from, I think, a strategic perspective. Like it or not, Russia has reemerged, and they are working very hard to become a dominant global power again. And they're doing it, I think, in a very crafty and smart and strategic way. China is an important, critical partner if we're going to accomplish anything in this region, or for that matter, anywhere else. You know, our European allies have stood by us, sometimes at the expense of some of their internal domestic political capital, but they've stood firmly by us, doing a lot of things that were relatively unpopular in their regions. But we have to work with all of the strategic partners as well as the regional partners in order to attack these problems and try to keep aligning interests and not get upset when our interests don't align and we don't necessarily make a little progress here or there and throw everything off the table because we can't get one aspect to work. We got to work it in as many ways as we can, I think.
On the continent, I think you're going to see more of the same. I mean, AFRICOM was, as I said, was stood up under a different model, and their kind of catchphrase is by, with, and through their partners on the continent, and that's why we don't have a large presence on the continent. We don't have large forces there, and so therefore everything that gets done through whoever the regional or the individual country partner is, and you can see it all over with all the major threats. So if you look at in West Africa, major problem in Mali, cooperating with the French. They have a huge force there, 4,000 troops spread across 4 or 5 countries, headquartered in N'Djamena, Chad, but reaching up all the way up to a lonely little base called Madama, right up on the border with Libya in Niger. We're helping them with logistics, while at the same time helping train all their partner countries as they operate in West Africa. They see that as their part of their vital national security interests, and we're happy to have them there doing that so we don't have to. You go over to Somalia. Somalia obviously has been, a problem my entire career, and everybody remembers. It's amazing how the term Black Hawk Down still hangs over everything, every conversation you have about Somalia inside the U.S. government. But it's an African success story in this, that the AMISOM, the African Union mission in Somalia, while it doesn't look like what a U.S. mission would look like, because of the local partners there, Uganda, Kenya, Djibouti even, have provided forces for the mission there in their sectors, have done a long way to keeping al-Shabaab pushed down, and as the U.S. partners with the nascent Somali government to try to build a national Somali army for security. It's going to take a long time. It's ugly. It doesn't look like what you'd like it to look like if you were trained in U.S. forces, but it's an African success story. So I think from the AFRICOM perspective, you'll see more and more and more of that across the continent as security situations develop.
I couldn't help but look at Major General Jones when you described that it sometimes isn't pleasant to look at, because, sir, as the CPAT lead, let me rephrase. As the CPAT lead, you had oversight of that development of the Ministry of Interior's forces in Iraq, and sometimes it's not pleasant to look at. It is a difficult process. It is going to be a long process, and I think there are potentially force structure or at least force employment considerations here as we go forward. If as General Casey, this will take a long time, more than the 16 years that we've been through, but perhaps another 30, as the Cold War took 50 years. Is there a force structure change? And let me cut right to the quick of what I'm getting at here. Special operations forces are designed to do foreign internal defense and host nation development of forces. We are now in a different world where we have asked our conventional forces to engage in some of those same kinds of tasks in a deployed environment. Was that an aberration, or is a CPAT headquarters and this sort of large-scale effort to continue to train host nation forces to provide security the way we should be looking at the world from this point forward? If it is the way we're looking at it, what's going to change in how we fund and deploy U.S. forces?
Well, I think you're seeing some of it already, and that is, actually this goes back, I remember I was at the War College in, I think it was 1997 or 8, somewhere in there, and General Brown was the commander of Special Operations Command, and he came and did a talk, and one of the things he talked about was the line between Special Operations Forces and conventional forces is blurring. And he was absolutely right. When you went to Iraq in 2005-6 timeframe, and you looked at an infantry squad or even a squad from an armor battalion or a artillery battalion going into a building, you would have had a hard time figuring out that they weren't some Delta or SOF outfit. They were geared up the same, they operated the same. Training foreign indigenous forces. We have figured out that conventional forces can do that in an effective way in the right situation and with the right training and so forth. So you're seeing all of that. You're also seeing the evolution of this cyber corps. I don't want to betray any confidences, but the reality is that probably about 7 or 8 years ago, I was in discussions where some senior leaders talked about Cyber Command and how we were going to evolve to this thing where this becomes a combatant command, in that where we have designated cyber forces and they are our supporting arm just like artillery or aviation or any other supporting entity. So you're seeing those force structure changes happening. You're seeing the blurring of roles and missions that occur in any dynamic area. So I think we're going to just see more of that. And the important thing that we have to do is figure out how do we become more agile and more dynamic. How do we, in the budgeting system that we have in the U.S. government, how do we adapt our acquisition system, the way we do personnel, the way we do commands and so forth, to be able to react fast enough that we have capability when and where it's needed, as opposed to be on the lag side of having to try to adapt to something that's already happened.
Yeah, I think the one thing that was particularly stark for me that I learned working with a number of the African militaries, it was relatively easy to get either a conventional or special operations force to the country to train the unit that you were supposed to train in whatever it is you were supposed to train them in. That was kind of the easy part. The hard part was all the stuff behind that you normally don't get to see. It was the institution building part. So the Ministry of Defense piece. Who's going to manage the defense budget? The general staff. Who's going to give the commands down to the lower these lower African these developing African militaries? Who's going to sustain all that? Who's going to repair the vehicles? Who's going to store the vehicles? Who's going to do the supplies and all those other things to keep that going? So that after that SOF unit, that a conventional force leaves and has tactically trained these folks, who's going to keep that unit in the field and keep them going so they can do their mission? That turned out to be the hard part. We didn't really have a problem finding the trainers to do that at the tactical level, but finding somebody who could get in there and help us build a Ministry of Defense, build an Army staff, build a logistics function, get them to buy the right vehicle, the vehicle they need, not the cool vehicle they want that they can't sustain, right? that was the hard part of all of that, and that goes beyond a force structure issue for the military and more of a capacity building capability at the civilian DoD level.
I'm sorry, that took me right back to one of those, there I was, standing in an Iraqi police motor pool with a fleet of Ford F-350s that ran on 93 octane fuel, and they didn't have 93 octane fuel, and they were all breaking down. Sometimes our solutions aren't exactly the solutions in that world. The last question from this chair, and then we'll turn it over to the audience, is the forward-looking. Therefore, you can prognosticate, and you can be right, wrong. It doesn't really matter. The nuclear proliferation discussion in the first panel this morning, there was a description of what potentially was the anticipated growth of nuclear states from 1 to 2, 2 to 4, 4 to 8, 8 to 16, that never actually transpired. Terrorism is a little bit different animal. Franchises, different ethnic groups that suddenly can empower themselves. That one has experienced some geometric growth. The question is, it's sort of a nexus question. Since nuclear states were sort of constrained by sovereigns and boundaries and interstate conflict, but terrorism is not. What are your thoughts about the nexus of either weapons of mass destruction or cyber terrorism with those terrorist groups and the threat that they pose?
I want to back up and kind of put that in context, if I could. In Art, I'm going to change my vote from last night when I talked about our biggest threats, because last night I voted for cyber as being the biggest threat. But I think I'm going to change my vote to something called the breakdown of the world order. That since the Treaty of Westphalia, we have had this set of rules that governed international and to some degree national behavior. And in reality, when you look at the threat of terrorism and other entities, to me, it's become a bigger issue. That it used to be violence was the domain of the nation state. That's who controlled violence. And we managed to muck our way through centuries where we had too much violence, we had too much war, but it was controlled in such a way. If you think about it, the last total war that we had was really World War II. We've had a ton of wars all around the world, but it really hasn't been total war. So now what we have, though, is we have the emergence of violence being controlled by non-nation states. And that ranges from terrorist organizations to you name it. And I'm going to use one example that's probably most dominant. Hezbollah is not a nation. Hezbollah has got a military capability that far surpasses most of the world's militaries. If you took, I don't know if you all looked at all these great flags we have around here, but look at all these flags that we have both in this room and behind you all the way around. These are all the flags of the world. If you were going to use Hezbollah as an example and take the number of rockets that Hezbollah has and rank them in order of all the nation states, and let's start from over here, work your way down these flags. When you get to Brazil, that's where Hezbollah would rank. And every other flag in this room would be behind. This is not a country, but it's got the capability of a country. Same thing in the cyber domain. ISIS has far better cyber capability when it comes to information warfare than I would say almost every flag in this room, with the exception of a couple. This movement towards non-nation states getting control of violence, I think, is a huge problem, and that's what we have to solve. We have to get nation states to be able to reassert themselves so they are the controllers of violence, and then diplomacy can work. Then economic kind of pressures can begin to work. But without the nation-state construct, I'm not sure that there is a very good prospect to reduce the amount of violence that we have.
In Africa, it's just slightly different. Many of the countries that we deal with that have the serious problems are weak states still trying to trying to pull themselves together in the post-colonial era. I think somebody the other day, I was at another forum and said that at the end of World War II, there were exactly 4 independent countries on the continent. And since then, all those other 54 countries, then 53 countries have gained their independence to varying degrees, and continue to struggle to govern the areas that were frankly were assigned to them by the European powers back in the late 1800s. So that's the bad news. The good news is that in most cases today, the non-state actors that have invaded, whether it's Boko Haram in Nigeria, whether it's Al-Shabaab in Somalia, whether it's AQIM over in Mali, and all those folks, while they're problematic, they're pretty much locally problematic at this point from the United States standpoint. You don't see a huge cyber threat except for the Nigerian prince who's abandoned his money. You know, you get that stray email, but there's no at this point no huge cyber threat, no nuclear, no country or entity that we're aware of that's trying to gain a nuclear weapon. That then has ambitions of taking that off the continent to go either into Europe or into the United States. That doesn't mean that in the future, that in the large number of undergoverned spaces that are out there, that somebody couldn't move in, could start to set up, and then start to operate from there. I mean, I think ISIS was probably the first. They started to move into Libya. For a while there, I think Libya was the designated backup country. If it all went bad, they were trying to move there. The Libyan, 250 militias and three governments, but the Libyans could get together on one thing. They didn't want ISIS there in Sirte, and so they've pushed them out of Sirte. They've pushed them down south into the desert. AFRICOM just did a strike on them, on ISIS last week down there. So continue to put pressure there. So I think for now, at least, there's not that threat of those organizations doing anything off the continent. Doesn't mean it couldn't happen in the future.
Okay. Well, thank you, gentlemen. I think all of you can see that although at the cocktail party, security in the Middle East didn't make the top 3, there are certainly enough things for all of us to be concerned about. And again, to reflect one more time on General Casey's remarks, although the cocktail party top 3 didn't include the Middle East, he did lead off with it. And these gentlemen have provided the backdrop of why it's an area that the U.S. will have to remain focused for, as General Casey said, many, many years. With that, we'll go to the audience for questions. Sir, right here. I'm sorry, I should have made it easier. Let's go here first.
General Jones, how is Iraq doing with keeping itself together as a country? You have the Shia, the Sunni, the Kurds. How are they doing? Going back to 1919 and those borders that were formed.
Right. Well, obviously there's better but not sufficient in order to address the fundamental problems. I mean, the fundamental problems is that you have 2 of the 3 major groups in the country who are disenfranchised with the national government. During the Maliki regime, he made it far worse than probably most of us could have imagined. So it's a long road back. They're doing some work, but frankly, the insertion of the Kurdish independence referendum doesn't help. How they deal is they kick out ISIS, in how they deal with Sunni control of the resources that are now going to be back under the control of Iraq is going to be important, and they are going to have to work through a way to somehow bring the Sunni population into the governance of the country. So it's there is some sign that the leadership is better than under the Maliki regime, but whether it's sufficient or not is has to be determined yet.
Gentlemen, thank you for your leadership and service. General Jones, my question for you is about the breakdown of the world order. We created that world order after World War II. So if it's breaking down, what can we do about it? And then follow up to that, are we doing it?
Say the question again.
What can we do about the world order that's breaking down because we created it?
Right. Okay. Well, there's a couple things. Actually, the world order, I don't view it as being created after World War II. Maybe some of the structural things are, but really, you go back many centuries to talk about how nations have dealt with each other. Honestly, I think we may have contributed to that. The rules by which countries operate with each other, in terms of respect for kind of the international law, what constitutes imminent threat that would allow you to attack another country. We have to kind of think of things in terms of, much more strategically in terms of second, third, fourth order effects. I have to tell you, after Gaddafi gave up his WMD program, there were a number of us saying that the number one priority for United States foreign assistance ought to be Libya. That the most strategic thing the United States could do is make Libya the poster child success story of what happens to a country that disavows WMD. We didn't do that. What we did was we tried to kind of hammer them and get them to mold themselves differently and do things that they didn't necessarily want to do. And we ended up eventually in a situation where, as somebody described earlier, what we have is sent, the message that we didn't intend to send, but that we have sent to people, is that if you have a WMD program, don't give it up, because if you give it up, you're done. And so we have to think much more strategically about how do our actions influence the world order and the ability for sovereign states to control their country. When are the conditions where the international community or even unilaterally we have to intervene somewhere and make sure we balance this so that we're not getting negative second and third order consequences that breaks down the rule of law in international relationships but actually promotes it.
No, I totally agree with that. I mean, I think the lesson out of Libya was exactly that, and I think deep down inside, where people don't want to talk about it, when they look at Syria, they look at Assad, and as bad as he is, they look at what happened after Libya. They look at what happened after in Iraq with the fall of Saddam. You can even go back, look at the Balkans. You remove the strong man, and what happens? And so I think that's certainly a one of the considerations there is they look at that problem.
Thank you. This is a question for General Lariviere. Do you see the growing engagement of China in the African continent as potentially posing ultimately a vital threat to the national interest of the United States?
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, the Chinese are absolutely all over the continent, and as General Casey said this morning, it's interesting to he described them as an economic threat, not a military threat. I can talk a little bit about that later, but they are all over the continent. They do $180 billion a year in trade on the continent. We do 60. They do it, no questions asked. It's very transactional. They want minerals. They want rare earth minerals or natural resources of some type, and they're not willing to. They don't ask questions. And so for a long time, I thought it was strictly transactional. There was no ideological piece to it. What I'm hearing now from some of my friends who are still working that portfolio is that the subtle message that they're sending now across the continent is that you can be an economic powerhouse like China and still have an authoritarian government, that it's okay. And then in some ways that's almost worse than if they were trying to spread communism ideology, because we can all get fired up about fighting communists. But them going in and saying, hey, you can be an economic powerhouse, but you don't have to give up your authority. I can't say that today. authoritarian rule is an interesting, subtle twist. But yes, they're on there. That's a huge conversation. Not many people realize this, but Djibouti, half the world doesn't even know where Djibouti is. Only place in the world where the U.S. and China face off each other across the bay with bases. It's the only Chinese overseas base, just went in here recently. And they're literally across the bay from each other as China starts to, at least in their, try to live up to their international commitments that base is theoretically there to support their contributions to the anti-piracy fleet off of Somalia. So yeah, China's certainly there. They're competitors. A lot of it, strategically, what happens is a lot of times, I saw it in Nigeria. We go in with our human rights requirements in order to sell them equipment, and the Nigerians went, "That's nice. I'll buy Chinese. They don't ask questions." It's all schlock. It's all junk, but you don't have to ask a lot of questions. So strategically, there's certainly going to be a lot of back and forth on the continent with the Chinese going forward.
Other questions, sir, in the back.
General, if you can hear me,
Yeah, I'm good.
General Lariviere, which country do you see in Africa that's most stable, safest, and friendliest to the U.S. and our interests that you would see as a model for other African countries?
Yeah, well, the country that loves us the most right now is Liberia, and I used to kind of half joke. We don't have a colony. We don't have any ex-colonies on the continent, but if we did, it would be Liberia. Obviously, because of their history, as repatriated slaves sent back to the continent. Because of the recent effort we did with them with the Ebola crisis, because Lyndon Johnson Sirleaf, the president, spent a lot of time in America, very close ties, love us. We were joking for a while when we had 3,000 troops there on the ground that she was secretly trying to move AFRICOM headquarters out of Stuttgart. She wasn't going to let them go. She was going to somehow manage to keep us to stay. I think they would probably qualify as a very close friend and everything, except you always wonder how stable they really are. But they have certainly come out of the Civil War, gotten through the Ebola crisis, and are making progress there. And there's some other bright spots too. I mean, there's Morocco is a very old friend. We have to play the same kind of fine line with them that we play with the Saudis about their monarch and their very, very, very slow move towards some sort of representative democracy. But Morocco's a firm friend. Tunisia has become very, very close as well. The Tunisians get it. They came to us and said they've come out of the Arab Spring with a cooperative government that's tenuous but trying to work together, and a realization that they've got a problem. They've got a terrorist problem and a military that's not set up to do that. They know that, and they want to change that, and they want our help to do it. So there's some bright spots.
My question is for General Jones. With the Kurdish referendum being passed and being voted on that the Kurds want to separate, Turkey and Iran made their distaste for that known with either threatening to invade the Kurdish country, their country, and then the Turks saying that they cut off economics with them. What do you see the repercussions of that being? Are they going to follow through with their threats? And if they do you think the U.S. is going to get involved?
Well, to some degree, I think we're already all involved. How important an issue is this, I think, is what you're really getting at for both Iran and Turkey. And what I would tell you is we should not underestimate how important it is. Turkey, think about how we think about ISIS and Al-Qaeda and that kind of business. The Turks think about the PKK and other Kurdish entities in the very same way. And so the idea of, their view is what happens is they've been in this fight with Kurdish nationalists now for a very long time to carve out something called Kurdistan, inevitably is an attack on their sovereignty over a portion of their country. The Iranians have the same feeling. They don't have quite the same history that the Turks do in terms of the level of violence. But the bottom line is I think I would put it in the vital national interest of Turkey in terms of how they see it. And then certainly the Iranians view it as a pretty serious national interest. And then the third element of the equation is the Iraqis. And I would tell you, I certainly think a declaration of independence by the Kurds in Iraq ends up in violence. I don't see the Iraqi government saying, okay, well, that's too bad. We hoped it'd turn out differently, but that's the way it is. I don't see that happening. So it certainly would incite, I think, a conflict.
And so maybe that brings us to this question over here.
Where is South Africa in all of this?
That's an interesting question. When I took over the Africa portfolio, I got a brief by one of the civilians there that's a long-standing Africa expert, and he goes, "Hey, sir, let me make this easy for you. Here's how we deal with this: draw a line at the equator, forget everything below. We don't deal with it." And South Africa was in there. South Africa's an interesting case. Because the African National Congress still runs it, and it's all the old gang, the leftover Mandela crew that still runs it. And because they still have bad memories from the apartheid era and the U.S. support for the apartheid government, or at least not putting what they consider not to be enough pressure on the apartheid government, South Africa keeps us at arm's length. And only deal with us at a very tangential and removed level. We do exercises down there. When I was division commander, we did send a crew down there, but it was a very benign exercise, a lot of humanitarian assistance kind of thing, not a real military exercise per se. And they have a real serious interest in holding our feet to fire. I'll tell you a funny story just very, very quickly. It's the stupid stuff that will get you in trouble. We have a long-standing dispute with them over landing fees. The United States military doesn't pay landing fees at government airfields. We insisted that a number of airfields down there were government-owned. We didn't pay the landing fees. They said they were private. They wanted the landing fees. Ongoing discussions. Mandela dies, and the South African government made it known that we were going to we understand the president's coming. We're confiscating every single aircraft up into including Air Force One if you don't pay the landing fees before you. And I can tell you, the U.S. Air Force still hates the Department of Defense to this day because the Department of Defense turned around and said, "Pay it, just pay it, get it done." And so the South Africans are an interesting case. We kept them at. They keep us, and we keep them at a little bit of arm's length.
Okay, last question, then I'm going to let our panelists give any closing comments they might have. Sir.
We've missed one country, that's the rolling calamity of the Congo.
All right, where's Art? Art House. You set me up, man. So here, the rolling calamity of the Congo. So I'm going to tell a story on myself and not answer your question. I have a mental block on the Congo. I had my guys made up a matrix for me of who all the players were and who all were supporting them and what the issues were, and I kept it on my desk because I couldn't remember it, and it was classified, and I didn't take it with me. I cannot figure that place out for love or money. It is literally the edge of the it's going to be the African World War if it ever gets out of hand, but it's a problem. The UN handles it. The U.S. stays at arm's length with it. It's a conflict we really don't want to be engaged with. We literally don't. Much like the Central African Republic, we fly in UN peacekeepers. We support the French when they need it, and we don't get involved in it.
I was going to give you time for closing comments, but I think you need a minute after that. Sir, closing comments on the Middle East?
Yeah, I mean, in terms of closing comments, I'd just say we've portrayed a pretty negative
situation in the Middle East. But I would tell you, it is not hopeless. The fact is, there is a lot of positive that we can say in terms of our approach. Number one, one thing to keep in mind is that the coalition that has been operating in this region now for coming close to 2 decades is still holding together pretty well. Our NATO allies, but we ought to keep in mind there are a whole ton of non-NATO friends. Down at Central Command, we have this thing called the Coalition Coordination Cell. There's still 50-some countries that have military folks down there so that we can work together to deal with all of these issues, primarily that are in this region, although they have tentacles elsewhere in the world. We have avoided interstate conflict now for some period of time, despite the fact that there's been potential to have it. So it's not all negative. This threat is still there, but we've managed to avoid it up until now, and there's a reasonable prospect with the right level of cooperation, diplomacy, all the elements of power that the nation can bring together, that we continue to influence it to do the same. There might even be some little fractures in some of the tensions. You probably didn't notice Muqtada Sadr's visit to Saudi Arabia lately. If you don't know who Muqtada Sadr is, go look it up on the internet. You'll find out terrible history there. But the bottom line is we actually have a Shia leader going to Saudi Arabia to have discussions. Who knows how real that was or what might come of it. But just the fact you get these two folks talking to each other could be a sign of some progress and so forth. So there is potential to incrementally deal with many of these problems. But I would just emphasize it will still take a long effort. It will still take significant resources, commitment, and most importantly, leadership by the United States in order to deal with and try to get towards an element of stability in the region that then can allow us to deal with some of these other problems elsewhere around the world.
Yeah, I guess just to finish up and go off with what Mike said, I'll go with the economist. It is the hopeful continent, and despite all the problems across the continent, growing population, a large desire for people to break out and be part of the economic success. From a security perspective, while they have their problems and certainly they have their fragile states, very little state-on-state conflict, and a desire to make their countries better. So I think we'll continue to take risks there, security-wise, and monitor it, and work mostly through state and AID on the development side. So there's hopeful for good things to come on the continent.
I'll just end by getting super granular and tactical, like I promised I might do. You know, I've laid in a sheep pen with a Bedouin sheep farmer in his backyard and had a conversation with him. I've stood at a police station where there was a blended force of Kurdish, Turkoman Shia, and Sunni Arab policemen all on the same force. I used to tell my soldiers every day before they went out on patrol, there may be 100 or 200 folks out there that mean to do you harm, but there's hundreds of thousands of people just like you. And I think this audience needs to know that that's really what it's all about. There are human beings that wish for a better way in whatever state they're in all across the Middle East. And to the gentleman's comment to General Casey, you know, all we're really trying to do here is make sure that moderate approach to life is what leads the day, not the extreme approach across that entire arc from Morocco to Malaysia. Okay, I think that wraps this panel. Thank you all very much for your time and attention.